Okay, so get ready for a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. We're going to be looking at language learning.
Awesome.
You've given us this study all about how different teaching styles actually play out in real classrooms. And you know me, I love seeing theory in action.
Yeah, and what I think is so cool about this study is that it goes beyond just telling us what's being taught.
Right.
It gives us like a glimpse into these subtle ways that teaching can actually impact how students learn.
Right. Like we all have memories, good, or maybe some are a little more traumatic, of our language classes from back in the day.
Right.
But this study breaks down those classroom moments in a way that I found genuinely insightful.
Absolutely. And to do this, they use some pretty structured observation tools. One that I thought was really interesting is this thing called the Kello-T scheme.
The KILL-T scheme. Okay, that sounds a little intimidating.
It's actually simpler than it sounds. COL-T stands for Communicative Orientation of Language Teaching. And it's basically a way to measure how much a classroom focuses on actual communication versus just, like memorizing grammar rules.
So, like, are the kids actually getting to use the language, or are they just stuck, like, dissecting verb tenses under a microscope?
Exactly. And the study looks in depth at 2 classrooms, each with like a totally different COL-T score. And it was fascinating to see how that one difference plays out in everything from the types of questions the teachers ask to how errors are corrected.
Okay, so it's not just about kind of like eavesdropping on classroom chatter. It's about looking for these clues about the bigger teaching philosophy that's at play.
Right. And to do that, they use this observation grid where they're marking down things like who's leading the conversation. Is it the teacher or is it the students? How are errors being corrected? Even, like, get this, whether the questions being asked are genuine or display questions.
Hold on. Genuine versus display questions. What's the difference?
Oh, it's subtle, but it's actually really important. So a display question is one where the teacher already knows the answer. Think back to your school days. What is the capital of France?
Oh, yeah.
They're asking just to make sure you know it.
Purely for demonstration, yeah. I've been on the receiving end of plenty of those.
We all have. But a genuine question is different. The answer is unknown. Or at least the teacher is genuinely curious about the student's perspective.
Okay.
These are open-ended questions that encourage real communication and deeper thinking.
Interesting.
And the study found that classrooms with more genuine questions tend to be more effective at fostering real language skills.
So it's like by analyzing the types of questions being asked, we can tell a lot about just the overall vibe of the classroom.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that.
Yeah.
The KELL-T scheme also looks at like the tasks that are given to students,
Right.
how errors are handled, even like the teacher's tone of voice.
It's like the teacher is setting the tone for the whole learning experience, just from the way they interact with the students.
Yeah, definitely. And you can actually see all these like subtle nuances playing out in the 2 classrooms that our study focuses on.
Okay, so let's jump in. First up, classroom A. Give us the mental picture. What's the vibe like in this language learning environment?
Okay. So imagine walking into a French class.
Okay.
Textbooks are open. Maybe there's a poster of the Eiffel Tower on the wall. And everything is very, very structured.
Ooh, I know that kind of classroom. Yeah, rules are important. Everyone in their place. Structure can be good sometimes.
Right. And in this case, Classroom A is all about structure. This is what the study calls a structure-based approach.
Okay.
Where basically, like, the teaching and learning are very much centered around, you guessed it,
Yeah.
grammar.
Makes sense. So lots of verb conjugation charts, maybe some sentence diagramming action. Oh man, I am suddenly feeling very thankful that my French classes are long behind me.
You and me both. But yeah, seriously, this classroom prioritizes explicit grammar instruction above pretty much everything else. So the teacher is walking them through tenses, like explaining every little rule.
And probably making sure everyone is taking meticulous notes.
Oh, for sure.
But remember that transcript snippet that you sent me, the one with the student, Paul?
Oh, yes. Poor Paul. Yeah, that exchange was almost painful to read, even if it, like, perfectly illustrates the study's findings.
Okay, so for our listeners who haven't had a chance to pore over these transcripts with the same intensity that we have, set the scene. What went down in this classroom?
Okay, so picture this. The teacher is asking students these, like, seemingly simple questions.
Right.
Probably to check their understanding of, like, the present continuous tense, right? Okay. She calls on Paul and asks him, "What are you doing, Paul?" It seems straightforward, right?
Totally. I mean, I'm assuming Paul was doing something, even if it was just sitting there politely, like the picture of attentive language learning.
Right, but here's the thing. Paul's response, nothing.
Nothing. No,
Yeah.
I am sitting. No, I am listening attentively. No, trying to come up with a French verb.
Yeah.
Just nothing.
Nope, just nothing. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Because on the surface, it just seems like a totally unremarkable interaction. Like Paul might just be a kid who, doesn't really feel like elaborating, but the study wants us to see something deeper happening here.
Exactly. See, this seemingly simple exchange actually reveals a lot about the power dynamics that are at play in a classroom like this. Remember how we were talking about genuine versus display questions?
Right, where the teacher might ask a question that they already know the answer to just to check your knowledge.
Exactly. And that dynamic is, like, key here. So the teacher, coming from this very structured, grammar-focused perspective, probably was trying to elicit a particular grammatical structure.
So in her mind, there's a correct, grammatically precise answer that she's looking for.
Right. But Paul, on the other hand, he's likely interpreting the question through the lens of his own, classroom experience. He's used to being quizzed, to searching for that right answer, to potentially being penalized for making mistakes.
So he's playing it safe. If I say nothing, at least I can't get the grammar wrong.
Exactly. And this little exchange, I think, highlights how a classroom's focus on structure can sometimes create an environment where students are more worried about avoiding mistakes than they are about actually communicating.
It's like the fear of getting it wrong just completely overshadows the potential joy of actually using the language.
Yes, 100%. And when we look at the full observation grid for this classroom, that pattern just keeps popping up.
Oh, tell me more. What other insights did these very, very eagle-eyed researchers glean from their observations?
Well, as you might expect, there's a lot of error correction happening in Classroom A.
Right.
Almost every time a student makes a mistake, the teacher stops the conversation to point it out and offer the correct form.
Which, don't get me wrong, error correction is important. But I can also see how, constantly being corrected might make you a little hesitant to actually experiment with the language.
Precisely. And that's not all. Remember we were talking about metalinguistic language.
Right, talking about the language itself rather than just using it.
Yeah. Well, Classroom A is like swimming in metalinguistic language. The students are spending a lot of time dissecting verb tenses, labeling parts of speech.
So less about actually speaking French and more about analyzing the mechanics of how French works.
Exactly. Which, again, isn't inherently a bad thing. Like, understanding grammar is important, but when it comes at the expense of actual communication.
It's like only studying music theory and never actually getting to, play an instrument.
Yes, a perfect analogy.
Okay.
And this brings us to a crucial question. What happens when we kind of shift the focus from grammatical perfection to actually using the language to communicate?
That is a very good question. And luckily, we have Classroom B to explore. Same age group, totally different approach. Are you ready to ditch the textbooks and, embrace the chaos of genuine communication?
Oh, I'm more than ready. Let's head over to Classroom B and see what happens when we loosen the reins a little, shall we?
Okay, so we are imagining ourselves stepping into Classroom B now. Same age group as our grammar-focused Classroom A, but a totally different energy, right?
Totally different. Think less about textbooks and verb conjugations and more about, well, I remember how much grammar lessons themselves used to bug you?
Oh, I do. Adverbs, conjugations, the subjunctive mood. Some of those grammar rules still haunt my dreams.
Well, in Classroom B, the teacher actually kind of turned that feeling of being bugged into a language lesson.
Okay.
They had the students talking about things that annoy them in French, of course.
So meta, using the language of frustration to, talk about frustration. I love it. It's relatable, it's engaging, and let me guess, it leads to some pretty authentic language use.
Exactly. This is a perfect example of what the study calls a communicative approach to teaching. So instead of picking apart the language bit by bit, it's all about just getting the students to actually use it, in a way that feels meaningful to them.
And I bet that even though the focus isn't explicitly on grammar, those kids are still learning the rules, just in kind of a different way, right?
That's the really cool part. One of the things the researchers noticed in Classroom B was how the teacher used something called recasting.
Recasting, like they're a language magician doing an illusion. Abracadabra, perfect grammar.
Huh. I wish it were that easy. But it's almost as cool. So basically, instead of stopping every time a student made a mistake, the teacher would just kind of repeat what the student said, but with the correct grammar or vocabulary.
So less about saying, nope, wrong tense, and more about just kind of subtly demonstrating the right way to say it.
Exactly. It keeps the conversation flowing. But it also provides those students with a constant model of correct language use.
Which, thinking back to like my own, awkward attempts at speaking French, sometimes hearing the right way to say something is so much more helpful than having all the grammar rules. Like, explain to me a million times.
Totally. It's like the difference between like reading about how to bake a cake and then actually watching a master baker do it right in front of you. You pick up on all these little nuances that you wouldn't necessarily get just from a textbook.
Plus, I bet it takes the pressure off a bit. Like in Classroom A, it sounds like every little mistake is under a microscope. But in Classroom B, the focus is on communication, not perfection.
You got it. And here's another little detail from the transcript that I thought was fascinating. The teacher in classroom B, they weren't afraid to get a little informal.
Oh, tell me they weren't pulling out the slang. Madame, I am so down with that.
They were. The researchers even noted that the teacher used like some slang words or phrases, which might seem kind of counterintuitive in a language class.
Right, because isn't the point to like expand your vocabulary beyond that's so fetch?
You'd think so, but it actually serves like a really important purpose. Remember, this is all about making language feel relevant and engaging for the students. And using a bit of slang, well, it helps create that connection.
It's like the teacher is meeting the students on their level, speaking their language, literally. And you know what they say, if you want to get someone's attention, you got to speak their language.
Right. And what's so interesting about this study is it gives us this peek into, the nuances of those teacher-student interactions. But it also takes us beyond that into the realm of student-to-student conversation.
Because let's be real, sometimes the most impactful language learning happens not at the front of the classroom, but when you're like huddled over a worksheet, desperately trying to make yourself understood to your, equally confused classmates.
So true. And the study actually highlights that dynamic by analyzing two very different scenarios of student-to-student interaction. Ready to see what they found?
Hit me with your insights. I am ready to be amazed.
Okay, so in the first scenario, we have a pair of students working on this classic picture description task, right?
Okay, classic language learning activity. I've been there.
We've all been there. One student has the picture, the other doesn't, and they have to communicate, in French, of course, to try to get their partner to draw like a replica of that picture.
Ripe with potential for miscommunication and frustration. I can already see it now.
Oh, absolutely. And the transcript does not disappoint. There are so many moments where you can just feel the frustration mounting as they struggle to find the right words, to understand each other's accents, the whole shebang.
And meanwhile, the clock is ticking. They're probably feeling the pressure to get it done. Yeah, I can see how this one might go off the rails.
But here's the thing. Even amidst all the miscommunication and like near meltdowns, what the researchers observed was actually really fascinating. So because those students are so focused on actually accomplishing the task at hand, right, drawing that picture, they end up providing each other with a ton of really specific language input.
Okay, so like instead of just saying it's a house, they're having to use more precise language to describe shapes, sizes, positions, all that good stuff.
Exactly. They're asking each other clarifying questions. Is it taller than a tree? Does it have a chimney? They're using gestures and even like drawing the air to try to make themselves understood. It's messy, but it's a far cry from the kind of carefully constructed sentences you might hear in a more structured classroom setting.
It's like the language of desperation, but in a good way. They're pushing each other to be more creative, more precise with their language, just to get the job done.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with the second student-to-student interaction. This one involves older students who are working together to like piece together this story. And the catch, the story relies heavily on these tricky reflexive verbs.
Ooh, reflexive verbs, the bane of many a language learner's existence. For those of us who might have repressed those particular grammar lessons, remind us what makes reflexive verbs so tricky.
So reflexive verbs are all about actions that you do to yourself. In English, we usually use pronouns like myself, yourself, himself, etc. But in French, they like to make it interesting. The structure is totally different and can be a real brain twister.
Right, and I bet that even when you know the rules of reflexive verbs, actually using them spontaneously in conversation is a whole other ballgame.
100%. So in this scenario, even though those students, they clearly have a decent grasp of reflexive verbs, in theory, they still stumble a bit when they're trying to use them naturally in conversation.
Because even the best grammar knowledge can sometimes fly out the window when you're caught up in the heat of the moment trying to, tell a captivating story.
Exactly. Now, what I found really interesting is that even though this interaction was less chaotic than the picture description task, there was also less of that rich, specific language input happening. They weren't pushing each other as hard to clarify their meaning or to experiment with new structures. It was more about just getting the story told, reflexive verbs or not.
So it's like, even though they were using more complex grammar and theory, the actual language learning that was happening might not have been as deep or as meaningful.
Exactly. And that brings us to like a really important takeaway from the study. Student-to-student interaction can be incredibly powerful for language learning, but the quality of that interaction really matters.
It's not just about throwing students together and hoping for the best. The tasks they're given, the level of support they have, even just the overall classroom culture, all of these things can make a huge difference in how much they actually learn from each other.
100%. And I think that's something that, you know, we can all benefit from thinking about, whether we're language teachers, students, or just people who are navigating a world where, communication is key.
It really makes you think about all those subtle ways that our interactions with others shape how we learn and grow, and how even those grammar rule-breaking moments of miscommunication and frustration can actually be some of the most valuable learning experiences we have.
Exactly. It's like embracing the messiness of real-world communication.
Well, on that note of embracing the beautiful, messy world of language, I think we're going to have to wrap up our deep dive for today.
I agree.
But for our listeners, don't think for a second that this conversation ends here. I mean, we've just scratched the surface of how different teaching styles play out in the classroom. And I want you to think about your own experiences. Whether you're a language enthusiast, an educator, or just someone who's fascinated by the power of communication, keep those observations coming.
Yes. Keep that conversation going. And who knows? Maybe you'll even discover some hidden linguistic treasures in those everyday interactions.
Absolutely. So from both of us, happy observing, and we will catch you next time for another deep dive.